Okay, well, I'd like to get started. For those of you who didn't attend the first part of this two-part hospitality training, my name is Matt Friedman. I'm the CEO of an organization called the Mekong Club. The Mekong Club is an organization based in Hong Kong, and we work with the private sector, including the hospitality sector, in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way across Asia. We have an association which has members that are from all over the world, from banks, from manufacturers, retailers, the hospitality sector, and so forth. As a public service, we offer support to different organizations to help them to understand the issue of modern slavery and human trafficking as it relates to their business. And this particular second part will go a little bit deeper into some of the implementation aspects that need to be done related to being a hotel and facing potential vulnerability association with forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. So I had a couple of people ask if I could just go over the last presentation very quickly, just a summary. So I'll just go through a few slides, and then from there I'll jump into some of the more practical suggestions on what hotels can and should be doing related to addressing this particular topic. To begin with, as most people know, there are all different types of modern slavery and human trafficking. During part one, we went into more detail about various cases. I won't do it in this particular presentation, but I'll just list the different categories that are relevant to the hotel industry. Number one is prostitution. There are 6.3 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world, and a certain percentage of these people who are victims find their way into hotels all across the world, so it becomes relevant from that perspective. Seafood. The fishing industries all over the world are considered to be fraught with modern slavery and human trafficking. There are many cases, for example, using Thailand as an example, where fishermen go out for years on these fishing boats, and during the time that they're there, they're used and abused, and as a result of this, the labor that is associated with fishing is sometimes tainted by accusations of human trafficking and modern slavery. Manufacturing, the bottom left-hand photo, we know of, for example, furniture or curtains or bed sheets or even mattresses and pillows and so forth that are sometimes associated with sweatshops, where you have people working 14, 15, 16 hours a day, every day, in order to accommodate orders all over the world, for which a certain percentage of those orders would end up in hotels. And lastly, construction. Hotels across Asia and the world are made by large companies. Sometimes these companies will have subcontractors that will bring in migrants that are under the radar, or just even local people, for which they exploit them for their labor on these construction sites. All of these various cases represent possible vulnerability for hotels, and you'll hear more about that as I go further into the presentation. As I mentioned last time, there's approximately 15 million people in modern slavery around the world, and 55% of them, which is more than half, are found in Asia, partly because of the size of Asian populations. There's 1.4 billion people in China, 1.4 billion people in India, and Japan and Indonesia and the Philippines. All these countries have large populations, so you would expect to find a larger percentage of people in modern slavery in this part of the world. When it comes to who is supposed to address the issue, it's supposed to be governments. All over the world, governments have systems and procedures in place. They have plans of action, and they have people who work on these particular issues. But as you'll see in a moment, many of these programs aren't having a significant impact. I worked for the United Nations. The United Nations has been working on this topic for a long time. But for the most part, the United Nations doesn't really get involved in the implementation of these activities, and so it's more theoretical. Papers, conferences, that type of thing. So it's the non-government organizations that are doing most of the work related to this particular topic. But again, if we go back to the statistics, out of the 50 million people, 77% is associated with forced labor, and 62% of that is associated with supply chains. which is why the private sector is getting involved. And when I say private sector, I mean a variety of different types of sectors. This includes the banks. This includes the manufacturers. This includes the hotels, the construction companies, the mining companies, even social media. And so all of these companies have a potential stake in being vulnerable to modern slavery. And so we have to take that into consideration. As I posed in the last presentation that I did, a report card for determining the extent to which people are being helped out of modern slavery each year, and out of the 500,000 criminals that are doing this, what I'll show you now is the number of people that were helped last year and the number of people that were convicted of the crime. So with all of the non-government organizations and the United Nations and the governments and the private sector working collectively, we're having virtually no impact at all. 108,000 people out of 50 million people were basically rescued out of modern slavery, and out of a 500,000 criminals, about 6,000 of them were put in jail. 1.2%. So the reason why I'm showing you this is to help you to understand how this issue, which for the most part was very much ingrained in the NGO world and the United Nations world, has found its way into the private sector. Why are all of a sudden companies, including hotels, focusing on this particular issue? And a lot of it really just comes down to the fact that when the world came to realize that the NGOs and the United Nations and the governments weren't having much impact, but at the same time, there was this relationship between this particular issue of modern slavery and supply chains and businesses. That's kind of the reason why we're seeing this transition over time. So why is it that we are not seeing more impact in addressing this issue among the non-government organizations? Basically, the profits generated from modern slavery are huge. Over 150 billion US dollars a year is garnered from the criminals. But the amount of money that's used to fight this is only about 350 million, or 0.23%. So what this demonstrates is that you have huge profits that are being generated by the bad guys, and only a small amount of money basically to fight this. In addition to this, the scale, the number of people like me, the do-gooder types that are working to fight this, it's about 25,000 to 30,000 around the world. The number of criminals, as I just indicated, is about 500,000. We have to follow rules and regulations. We have to make sure that what we do is within rule of law. We have to go and get permission from our donors and so forth. If you're a criminal and you're exploiting people, you don't have to do any of those things. If somebody gets close to your business, you just mutate, evolve, hurt somebody, do whatever it is you can to avoid this. And so obviously they have an unfair advantage. And lastly, awareness related to these topics is very low. Most people who I deal with in the private sector, including the hospitality sector, don't know much about this issue. I hope from the part one presentation that I did last time, you were able to walk away with a better understanding of this issue and the relevance and the importance of it. But what we're really going to do now is kind of shift over to looking at, well, what can the private sector do, and what is the private sector doing in more detail. So, but before I do that, I just want to emphasize one more aspect, and that is this: that because the governments, because the United Nations, because the organizations that were looking to fight human trafficking felt like there wasn't being much done in order to address this, this is why we're switching over to the private sector being involved. And so about 10 years ago, we saw this shift take place. And it's based on a certain number of trends of activities and actions that have been taking place to basically incentivize the private sector to get involved and to do more related to this. And so let me just go through these very quickly, because once again, they're relevant to why, as hotels, you're addressing this particular topic. The first shift that we see is legislation. So prior to 2012, there wasn't really legislation that forced companies or brands to focus on this particular topic. But then the first legislation, the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, came into play. And what this act basically says is that if you're a big company and you have any services or products in California, you have to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. If you're a Japanese company and you're selling cars there, you have to do that. So it basically addresses companies all over the world. Then the UK Modern Slavery Act came, basically said the same thing, but went a little bit further, said that you have to have annual reports, and those annual reports have to be signed by the board of directors. Then you have the French Act and the Australian Act and the Canadian Act and then the German Act. And these acts keep adding additional requirements. The German Act says that your supply chain has to have grievance mechanisms. The Canadian Act basically says that if you have an issue or a problem, then basically related to modern slavery, you can be fined and penalized. So these acts incentivize companies to step up and get involved. I mentioned there were lawsuits, and I'll go into more detail related to that. When you have lawsuits, these lawsuits get into the general media, they get into social media, and as a result of this, this can result in naming and shaming and embarrassments for a particular company. We see that the news coverage related to human trafficking has doubled every year for the past 10 years and continues to expand. And so the more news you get related to this, the more appetite the general public has for additional information. But remember, most news is often negative, and it often names and shames organizations. And as a result of this, you have a lot of companies, for example, that are afraid that if something gets into the newspaper, it could hurt them. And in fact, that actually happens. And I'll talk about some of those cases as well. And lastly, sustainability and ESG and corporate social responsibility. As companies, your clientele want to make sure that you're green. Your company wants to make sure that you have governance systems and procedures in place. Your company wants to make sure that the social side, which includes modern slavery and human trafficking, are not being compromised. So all of these factors have contributed to the hotel and the hospitality industry kind of waking up and recognizing that they have to address these issues, because if they don't, it can have an impact on them. At the same time, there are also opportunities. If hotels and the hospitality sector step up and do things to proactively demonstrate that they care about employees, and they can use that as a promotion and a means of gaining some traction within the market to demonstrate that, in fact, they care. And this helps clients to want to go to these hotels around the world. So let's jump right into why hotels should care about this particular topic. And again, what you saw was a recap of the part one. But what I'm really going to do now is to really help to go a little bit deeper into the systems and procedures and processes that we're seeing actually happen across the hospitality sector, not only here in Asia, but in other parts of the world. Some of them are specifically related to Asia. Some of them are related to other parts of the world that eventually will hit Asia with the same types of things. And you'll see what I mean as I get into this. Okay, the first reason why organizations should care is that the expectation among ESG and corporate social responsibility and sustainability people these days is that you need to understand the S in ESG. You need to understand that there is vulnerability within your supply chain, within your business, that could potentially be an embarrassment. And as a result of that, you need to understand this. But as a person who does about 120 presentations a year, I often find when I'm in front of an audience, and it's different when you're on a webinar because you can't see people, but when I'm in front of an audience and I ask the audience, let's say there's 100 people from a hotel, how many of you knew 20% of what I was talking about before I said it today? I usually don't get anyone raising their hands. So if a person within an organization, a hotel, for example, doesn't know about an issue, they're not going to care about it. If they don't care, they're not going to do anything. So it's really important for awareness to be put in place. So the reason why we provide this type of training is to educate and inform and make sure that you and your colleagues understand the relevance of this particular topic to your business. So when it comes to the vulnerability, I mentioned them earlier, but I'm going to restate them, and we'll go through each of these categories. There are basically four main categories. The first one is supply chains. You guys buy things. You buy a variety of different types of products, as well as you hire different services to support your particular business. If the workers who are associated with those supply chains are being exploited, and somebody makes a connection between that business and you, it can result in some naming and shaming. Contract work. There are now all kinds of rules and regulations related to how people who work within businesses should be treated. But the people who suffer most tend to be migrants. So, for example, in Macau, you have lots and lots of hotels and you have lots of hotel rooms. When it comes to local people to help provide the services for those hotels, you just don't have a large number of people locally who want to do that work. So many of the workers within those hotels are coming from outside, and they're migrants, and they're coming from different locations where, as part of the migration process, they can be exploited. They can be forced to pay a certain amount of money for their job. And then when they get there, the jobs can be changed. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. Construction, I mentioned that as well earlier. You have hotels that basically are contracted out to large companies, construction companies. And those construction companies, in order to get the work done, will have subcontractors and subcontractors. And so the people who move the sand and the bricks and the stones and do the work to clean things up often will use the lowest the paying people available, and sometimes these people are being exploited significantly. And lastly, prostitution. Now, in this part of the world, like all over the world, you have different forms of prostitution. I have lived and worked in and visited just about every Asian country, and you see a variation of what prostitution is, ranging from Thailand, where you see it very much right out in the open with the girly bars and the discos and the various sites where the sex is sold, to Hong Kong, where you hardly see anything at all. Everything's kind of behind closed doors, and every country has its own kind of fingerprint related to this particular topic. But let's start in talking about, as an organization, the Mekong Club provides advice and guidance to companies, and we help them to understand that there are certain component parts that have to be put in place in order for a company to meet a standard of ensuring that they are doing the right thing related to human trafficking. One of the first things that we often offer in terms of advice and guidance is the relevance and the importance of training. Training is essential. And when I see training, it includes kind of almost two parts. One is general awareness raising, so people understand what the topic is. And then training would be kind of taking that one step further and helping organizations to understand what they need to do with the information that they have. Now, recently with a large hotel chain outside of Asia, we did a series of presentations. We did a 15-minute presentation to the C-suite, to the leadership and the board people associated with this. We did a 30-minute presentation for directors and managers so that they understood this. We did a 2-hour presentation for key staff within the organization. And then we had a town meeting that allowed for anyone and everyone to basically learn about this. Now, the reason why this particular company felt that this was relevant and important is because they felt that they wanted everyone in the organization to understand when the word modern slavery, when the phrase human trafficking or forced labor comes up, they would understand what it is, and they would understand why it would be relevant to a particular company. So this particular organization, they felt that this was really important. So we did this by having a variety of different approaches. We had some in-house training, which was similar to part 1 and part 2 of what you're seeing here. Some of the people wanted training that went beyond what we were able to offer, and that was outsourced. We did both face-to-face training, which I prefer, and it's much easier to kind of relate to a population of people listening to a talk like this in an audience, as well as online training. And then after we did the training, we offered e-learning modules. For those of you who know about the Mekong Club, we have various tools. One of the tools that we have are a series of e-learning videos, and those e-learning videos are offered to the general population. Sometimes they are required to watch the videos, and sometimes they're even required to fill out questionnaires. It all depends upon the organization, whether or not, as an association member of the Mekong Club, you go to that particular extent. Another thing that we're doing is working with different hotels to develop what I would describe as small theme pieces. So let's say that, for example, a hotel wanted to help explain the relevance of procurement in modern slavery. A 3 or 4 minute video could be developed. These short videos are initially done in English, but then they're translated into the local languages. And the reason why both e-learning and these types of videos are relevant and important is that most of the content that's out there related to human trafficking is in English, but a lot of people don't have English as their first language, and so they need it in other languages. So whatever videos or e-learning you have, it's really important to have it in as many different languages as possible, so that your population really understands exactly what's being said. And I know this because I speak different languages, and if I see a webinar or an e-learning in a language as kind of a not a fluent speaker, I understand about 50% of it. But if it's in my language, I understand everything. There's a lot of webinars that are out there related to modern slavery and the hospitality sector. We have them. There are other organizations like the Shiva Foundation and even other hotel chains that offer these types of webinars, so that if you're looking for a particular topic related to the hospitality sector, you can Google, modern slavery, webinar, hospitality sector, and you can find these things. And sometimes they go into specific elements of what needs to be done. And so this is really worthwhile to have. So based on needs, identifying what your organization needs internally in order to ensure that the general population understands the topic, the specific professionals that need to address this understand the topic, and the leadership understands the topic, so that they will ensure that everyone else is mandated to receive the information that's needed. That's an important part of the process. Another thing that we sometimes see that hotels provide are information to their clientele. For example, I've been in hotels in both Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam that have pamphlets related to modern slavery. In the booklets that you have that kind of describes the services related to what a hotel offers, sometimes you'll see an insert that says this particular hotel has a zero policy related to modern slavery and sex trafficking, or we'll say something about ESG, saying that we responsibly source our linen and our furniture and various other things. And as a result of that, they're basically making a statement that we care enough to address those types of things. I've even seen in one case in Europe, a short video that basically says modern slavery and human trafficking is a terrible thing. And while you're in this particular location, there are certain things that happen in this location that you should know about it. They weren't specifically talking about their hotel, but they were talking about the fact that modern slavery exists. And they were just doing that as a public service. So sometimes awareness goes beyond the staff and includes the clientele as well. The second point is that when we work with hotels, we often encourage that they have an individual or a team that are the focal people for addressing the issue of modern slavery. That could be any number of people. It could be a director, it could be somebody within the corporate social responsibility or ESG office. Sometimes I've even seen it be among security or the department that the supervisor who looks at the cleaning elements. Procurement sometimes does it, or a combination of these particular individuals. I've worked with one hotel that convenes on a quarterly basis, bringing all of these people together with a lead person who's the focal point for anything related to human trafficking. So let's say, for example, legal people within the organization wanted to understand the legislation. They'd go to that team or that focal person for that information. Let's say that the C-suite or the CEO level or financial highest level people were interested, they would go to that team or that focal point. So that team or that individual gets the training and the expertise to be able to know what is happening both within the organization, but also where to go for additional information if somebody asks questions. So, for example, when we work with a hotel, we'll identify an individual, and let's say that that individual gets a request from the legal people to the procurement people, and they don't have an answer, then they come to us and we answer that question. But everyone knows who that person is or who that team is. And as a result, they can get their answers from those particular individuals. But when it comes to kind of sorry, I can't see this slide from here. the supply chain elements of addressing procurement and so forth. This is a topic that just now companies are beginning to pay attention to. So, for example, in the past, and I know this because I worked with a couple of hotels when I was living and working in Thailand, the procurement people didn't know anything about the topic of human trafficking. They would buy fish, they would buy the linen, they provide services and so forth, and they would just put a request for proposals out there, and then they would take the lowest bid, and then based on that, they would make a determination as to whether or not this particular company was going to get the bid. Now, what's happening is in procurement offices, they're beginning to look at all their suppliers, both for goods and services, and then they're rating these suppliers to determine the extent to which there might be some vulnerability. And the reason why they're doing this, again, is because there is a lot of information out there talking about suppliers who, for whatever reason, do things that are considered to be inappropriate from the perspective of the general population. For example, there are companies that are accused of not being green enough or polluting or, exploiting their workers and so forth. This information gets into social media. This information makes it onto the news. And as a result of that, if you're on the receiving end of this, if you're a company that somebody's calling you out in this particular situation, you're not going to have a very good day that day. And I'll just use the manufacturing sector as an example. There was an organization in the UK called Boohoo, and they basically make fast fashion. They were accused of modern slavery. We looked into it, and it wasn't even modern slavery, but the world thought it was modern slavery, and that had an impact of reducing their market share by over 2 billion sterling pounds. So a bad article related to something like this can really have a devastating impact on a particular company. I mentioned the last time we were talking that seafood industry and the chocolate industry are often identified as industries that have issues with their supply chains. For example, there's a lot of lawsuits against seafood companies. The plaintiffs are saying because you are getting seafood from a particular location that we know has modern slavery, then you're supporting modern slavery. So many of these cases don't make it to fruition. They're dropped out of the courts, but the lead up to this in the media coverage of this results in a serious naming and shaming of different sectors. The chocolate industry, same type of thing. Back about 10 years ago, BBC did an expose on children who were forced into slave-like circumstances in the cocoa farms. And then this kind of tainted the chocolate industry because chocolate, you want to be associated with Valentine's and Easter and birthdays and good things. But if you have modern slavery associated with that, it can have a devastating impact. So these industries, you have to watch them because if you're buying from particular companies that are outed in the press, sometimes they make a connection between your business and their business, and that can be a problem. I also mentioned in part one, the fact that there are other types of businesses that can sometimes be tainted. For example, some hotels outsource their cleaning. And so you have, cleaners coming in who are being managed by a third party organization. I've seen this in the Singapore context where those service providers sometimes significantly exploit those workers, and that can have a direct effect on a particular business. Even people who do things like delivering packages to different businesses could be fraught with this type of thing. So as you're looking at your suppliers, you have to ask questions of these suppliers. Do you have systems and processes in place that ensure that your people know about human trafficking? Are you monitoring this? Are you providing training? Are you raising awareness? All those things are important. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute related to that. Other kind of products that have been identified as being potentially associated with modern slavery include corn, nuts, coffee, cattle, sugarcane, sunflower seeds, prawns, palm oil, beans, and sesame, and so forth. So these products, there's a list that is available online with the Department of Labor. The ILO also puts out a list that identifies not only products, but products within specific countries. So, for example, Malaysia is often associated with palm oil being an issue and a problem. And so palm oil is in many products that you find in hotels, not only the food, but also in some of the shampoos and some of the oils that are used to give away to your clients and so forth. You have to be aware of the fact that there are some companies that are being called out. And if you're called out and you're in this kind of a situation, and you're associated with that product, it can create a problem. And to just give another example, this isn't related to modern slavery, but an example that demonstrates how a particular issue can be directly relevant to hotels is about 10 years ago. Remember the shark fin soup phenomena, where there was tremendous pressure on restaurants and hotels to remove shark fin soup from the hotels' restaurants? Now, for a while, there were a certain number of major hotels that have been serving this for years and years, and they basically said they weren't going to do it. But then the campaigns went after them. And so you saw these massive campaigns that were actually talking about specific hotels and saying this hotel is basically contributing to the mass reduction of sharks around the world. It had a devastating impact. And as a result of this, a certain number of hotels dropped this from their menu. In fact, you can hardly find shark fin soup anywhere in different parts of Asia anymore because of this pressure. But there's a certain number of clients that remember that that particular hotel took a while in order to move forward with that activity. That can have a lasting impact. So what hotels are doing is they're really kind of looking at their supply chains. Procurement offices are stopping to take, let's say, and this is a real example. There's a hotel chain that I worked with that had 300 suppliers. And out of the 300 suppliers, they kind of rated them from the locations of where they were getting their goods from and the size. And then what they did is they said, well, 150 of them are like too small for us to really pay much attention to. The other 150, computers and linen and furniture and services that were seemed like they were significant enough. So they mapped it out. They identified who these organizations were, and they looked at the various tiers associated with them. And they used this because they said we need to follow some type of a process to ensure that we determine the extent to which any of these organizations have vulnerability. And if they have this vulnerability, what we want to do is to make sure that we are able to protect ourselves from them. So, for example, if there is a particular seafood provider from, I'm just using arbitrarily, Thailand, that has been identified in the newspapers repeatedly as having issues and problems, you might want to look at that organization and consider whether you want to work with them, and then consider somebody else who's not in that situation. So it's extremely important to know your suppliers, to map them out, and to identify which of them fall into particular categories. For example, if you are basically procuring, let's say, bed sheets from Myanmar versus, let's say, the UK, the difference between those two countries, because of the environmental scenarios that allow for forced labor to take place in one and not in the other, demonstrates that there is geographical vulnerability. And so you need to take the location of that supplier into consideration as well, because countries are also rated based on the extent to which modern slavery and human trafficking takes place. And we manage this process. We look every year to see what those relationships are, because it's important for us to be able to go back to the organizations we work with to say that this particular country has dropped down in the ratings related to this. And so there's more vulnerability in that country related to forced labor. So in some cases, using that 300 supplier example, where they got it down to 150, they actually went to the suppliers and asked them questions. Do you raise awareness? Do you provide training? Do you do various other things? And as a result of those answers, they were able to make a determination as to whether or not they wanted to do an audit, or they wanted to do follow-up calls, or they wanted to perhaps identify another supplier. So these questions are relevant and important. And so these are just the types of questions that you would ask. Does your company raise awareness? Do they have a team that focuses on addressing this issue? Are there focal points within the organization? Do you have a policy that says that you are against modern slavery and human trafficking? Do you train your people? Um, do you have some type of auditing approach for the big procurements that you do? When you do contracting, do you add clauses in there that says that you are an organization that has zero tolerance related to human trafficking? And if you find issues, to remediate them. So these are very simple questions that could be asked. It could be asked in the form of a survey. Mekong Club's in the process of developing this in an automated form. So what happens is that the hotel and banks use this as well. These would be organizations that don't have a huge number of suppliers, but want to do their due diligence. The way this particular mechanism works is there's a geographical algorithm that's based on the geography of where that company comes from, because there's vulnerability associated with that. And then there's about 10 yes, no questions. And so the supplier fills this out, and then based on what they fill out, then you can get a general risk rating on that particular location. It doesn't mean that you don't use them. It just means that you have to be more cautious when it comes to providing or procuring services and goods from that organization. Another thing that the Mekong Club does is we developed a supplier toolkit, which is online. It's free for any organizations, that basically helps suppliers to understand what are the ILO indicators of modern slavery? What is the legislation related to this topic? And we have videos and so forth, but we have this information basically in multiple languages. And the reason why this is important is that, we assume that the suppliers that you're working with know all about modern slavery and human trafficking, but most of them don't. And they don't ask questions because they're afraid if they ask questions, it will kind of help the people that they're providing services or goods to recognize that they don't know anything about this. And so it's really important to have suppliers receive training. For example, next month, the Mekong Club is providing training to SMEs and suppliers in Vietnam. And, every time we do this type of training, lots and lots of suppliers sign up. We do it in Vietnamese so that they're able to understand the relevance, the importance of this. But this is really important for suppliers to have the basic information. And sometimes, as I mentioned, with e-learning and so forth, if you have this information in local languages, you can provide your e-learning to them as well, and that helps to raise their general awareness and so forth. The last thing I'll say related to this is, one more slide after this, is the reason why this is important isn't just to protect yourself from bad things. It's to be able to put into your sustainability and ESG reports the fact that you are working to ensure that your company is free of modern slavery. You can say that you have policies. You can say that you provided training. You can say that you basically are screening your suppliers and so forth. There's a lot of organizations that have to submit these transparency reports because of the legislation in the UK, the United States, and so forth. And being able to make these statements that indicate that, in fact, you care is a positive thing. And the reason why this becomes relevant is that sometimes if you don't have this type of information, you can lose ground. I'll talk about that in a second. We all know what the ESG is related to the private sector and indicators of environment and governance and social related to that. But by doing something to protect your employees and your business, you're also supporting what are called the Sustainability Development Goals. These are the United Nations goals that governments all over the world support, related to basically the environment and pollution and how human rights and everything else. And so by addressing ESG goals, you're also addressing SDG goals. And again, I've seen in sustainability reports, organizations saying that we are supporting SDG 8 and 12 and 17 because we're doing X, Y, and Z related to protecting our particular business. The next category is looking at policies and codes of conduct for organizations. Now, generally, for many of the companies that I've worked with in the hospitality sector, they have some type of a statement that's integrated within their supplier codes of conduct that talk about zero tolerance for forced labor and so forth. But many of them don't have what I would describe as a statement that's on their website for their clientele to see, that says, as an organization, we do everything we can to protect our business from modern slavery, child labor, forced labor, et cetera, et cetera. Um, People are looking for those statements now. And if they don't find it, sometimes they'll email the organization or call them up or whatever and say, do you have some type of code of conduct? Because just as the clientele are trying to ensure that if they're going to stay at a hotel, that it has certain green policies to ensure that the hotel isn't exploiting the environment and so forth, people care about the clientele as well. So the thing about this is if you don't have a policy, it's not a problem because you can find them very simply. You can just look at some of your competitors to what they have, or you can find generic ones that are online that are just one or two paragraphs that you can adjust to your organization. Sometimes it's just internally, sometimes it's externally, sometimes the language goes into your request for proposals and your procurements and everything else. And as a result of that, it's really important for you to make sure that you have these things in place. Now, those of you within the hospitality sector may have heard of what's called the code. And this is basically something that an organization called ECPAT puts out. And they've been kind of going to hotels for years. It really focuses more on kind of sexual exploitation of people and children and so forth. But it basically says that we as a hotel agree that human trafficking and child labor and sex trafficking and all of that and use of children and prostitution is wrong. And we have systems and procedures in place in order to protect our clientele. And in fact, in Cambodia, I've been to hotels where I see that on the wall. I see it, displayed, the fact that they are members of the code. So this is another way of addressing it. The relevance of this, I was in Bangladesh not too long ago, and I was presenting to some SMEs. And this particular SME was a small organic food company. And there were only about 4 or 5 members of this particular business. But a bank wanted to cater that particular restaurant. So they went to them and said, okay, this is what we want. How much will it be? But then after they got the quotation, they said, do you raise awareness about modern slavery with your staff? Do you have a code of conduct? Do you have systems to protect your supply chain? This organization had no idea what they were talking about. They were just trying to do their business. And they lost the bid because the bank required that information to be in place. There was another organization that had been asked these questions before, put these things in place, and as a result of that, they got the business. So we're seeing these types of kind of questions being asked of restaurants, of travel agencies, of hotels, and so forth. So the relevance of addressing these components is really important and relevant as part of the business that you have. So as I say, there's policies online. These policies allow for you to just pick and choose the language that you want. I've seen policies that are 2 pages long related to this, and I've seen policies that are 3 sentences. It's really up to you to decide the extent to which you want to make a statement associated with this. Okay, another area would be third-party contracts. And in this particular case, I'm talking specifically about people that would be hired by your organization. And I'm going to focus on migrants in this particular case. The last time we talked about this, I mentioned that auditors, when they go in to look at particular businesses, are looking for what's called ILO indicators of modern slavery. Now, if your hotel is being audited, you would, as part of the hotel, have different questions that would be asked to ensure that your employees or your service provided individuals are not having any kind of issues associated with the vulnerability of modern slavery. And so there's about 11 different indicators here. Last time in part 1, I went through these indicators. I'm going to do it again just because I think it's worth emphasizing the relevance and the importance of this process of looking at your employees, especially the migrants, to ensure that there are no indicators of modern slavery. So out of that list of 11, I'm focusing on 5 of them. So in the case that I talked about last time, you have a Nepalese person. He's basically working in his village, making 30 or 40 US dollars a month, not really thriving in that situation. He goes paycheck to paycheck. And then the recruitment agent goes into that location and says to the guy, how would you like to make some money? A lot more money, like $250. Guy says, great. Sounds great. What do I need to do? Recruitment agent says, you got to go to Kathmandu. You got to sign some papers. We'll get a passport. We'll train you. We're going to send you to Macau. You'll work in one of the hotels. So prior to doing all this, he's told that there's one more thing he has to do. He has to put up 1,500 US dollars. Well, this guy doesn't have 1,500 US dollars. He's living in a village. He has no savings and so forth. So he says, well, I can't pay that. The recruitment agency says, okay, well, don't worry about it. We'll get somebody to cover that. And so the person basically agrees to, get a loan, not knowing that there's huge interest rates and fees and so forth. So by the time he gets to Kathmandu, the capital, to get his training, it's no longer 1,500, it's 3,000. By the time he gets to Macau, it's about 4,500. So he gets there and he ends up working 2-3 years just to pay back that debt, not sending anything home. So before he was poor, now no money's going home. Now, this is an indicator of modern slavery because it's called debt bondage, because that debt holds him in place. He can't leave until that debt is paid back. And that's why it's an indicator. Another indicator is contract substitution. He signs a contract in Nepalese. He knows what it says. Then when he gets to the country, Macau, in Cantonese or Chinese, there's a contract. He's told to sign it. He looks at it and says, I don't know what it says. They say, sign it. They say, if you don't sign it, we're going to send you back. You're going to lose everything. So he signs the contract. But what it does is it further cheats him. He has fines and penalties and fees that he doesn't understand. So he's not really making 250 US dollars. He's only making 125. And again, that's being used to cover his fees. As part of that contract, there are wage deductions. So food wage deductions, or if he uses the toilet too often, there are deductions, or if he doesn't clean rooms or dishes or whatever it is that they're supposed to do. And so those are written into the contract, and those deductions basically cheat the person as well. When he gets there, they take his passport and they say they need it for their work visa, but they don't give it back. So let's say after a couple of years, he said, I had enough, I'm going home. He goes to the manager, says, give me my passport. Manager says, no. Guy says, what do you mean no? Give me my passport. No, you said you're going to be here 4 years. You're going to stay 4 years. Guy says, I'm going to tell the police you have my passport. You're not giving it to me. The hotel manager says, well, who are they going to believe? We're going to say we don't have it. They're going to realize you don't have your documentation. They're going to put you in a remand center or jail. They're going to send you home. You're going to lose everything. So the passport holds the person in place. That's why it's an indicator of modern slavery. And lastly, living conditions. If you see living conditions like what you see in this picture here, where you have 20 people in a room, one bathroom, and so forth, that's also an indication of exploitation. And so what companies are doing is they're putting policies in place. As I mentioned, they're training people, they're making sure that their audits really go deep to determine that these individuals are not being exploited. We're also seeing in a lot of manufacturers and retails will insist that if they go to a supplier or a factory, that none of those employees can have any indebtedness. So if let's say that you're a toy company and you want to make a product in a particular factory and you find out that there's indebtedness, that toy company will say to that factory, we will not work with you until you pay that debt back. And then once that debt is paid back, then we can have this relationship. It's called responsible recruitment, and it's a trend that we see not only in the manufacturing retail business, but also in the hotel business, where hotels are ensuring that, in fact, if they get any recruits from a particular location, the recruitment agency isn't charging any money associated with that. And lastly, hotlines, where you see grievance mechanisms or apps that allow for employees to report back, the living conditions and what they're experiencing and so forth. The next category I want to talk about is related to prostitution. Now, prostitution exists all over the world. There's literally the estimate that I've seen recently is a couple 100 million women and girls and boys and men as well, not as much in prostitution around the world, but a certain percentage of prostitution is forced prostitution. In fact, a lot of prostitution is. But according to the official figure that the United Nations have related to human trafficking, they say the figure is 6.3 million. What you see here is a data sheet out of the United States. And Polaris is an organization that runs a hotline. And calls will come in from people all over the United States saying, I'm in trouble, or somebody will report a human trafficking case and so forth. And the Polaris Project will basically investigate these cases, bring law enforcement in, and work with the local NGOs in order to support these activities. But according to the data here, and you see this is a little bit dated, I wasn't able to get the latest data, that a certain number of calls are coming from hotels where a particular person who's in a forced prostitution situation, maybe she's waiting for a client, or maybe it's in between clients or somebody, and they call and they say, I'm in trouble. So you can see that like the hotel industry in different parts of the world are being used for prostitution. Now, in the United States, as a result of this situation, hotels are being sued. All of these hotels that you see on here, and I can show this because this is in the public domain in terms of articles related to this, have been sued because a raid and rescue of a sex trafficking victim was done. And because it was happening in a particular hotel, they're saying that you're contributing to it. You should have known this was happening. Now, to a certain extent, it's really hard for hotels to know what's happening. In some ways, it's unfair. But what's happening with these cases is they're being won. And so you could have a hotel being sued for $250,000 US. And when that goes through, the hotels have to pay it, but they're using their insurance companies to pay it. So what's happening is insurance companies are now saying, we don't know if we want to insure the hospitality sector because we can't bear these types of lawsuits and so forth. This is happening only in North America now, but we're beginning to see it moving into Europe, and eventually it'll make its way to this part of the world. We don't see it now, but it's just something that has to be put on the radar. In fact, in the United States, you have law firms that specialize this, that basically say if you are a sex trafficking victim and you know the hotels you've been staying at, you let us know and we'll go after these companies for you. And as a result of this, it creates a tremendous amount of vulnerability for the hospitality sector in that part of the world. We're also seeing bills or laws that are put in place in different locations. One recently, this bill will allow sex trafficking survivors to sue hotels that turn a blind eye. The Connecticut law basically talked about the relevance and the importance of training staff because they wanted staff to know what the signs were related to modern slavery and human trafficking or sex trafficking within their hotel so that they could avoid these types of lawsuits and so forth. So this is a trend that you're seeing in other parts of the world. But generally, these trends will spill over to Latin America, Africa, and eventually Asia. It's just a matter of time before we move in that particular direction. So what we're seeing is the legal landscape for hotels is changing and creating vulnerability for legal liability. The legal fees can be devastating, and this could create a problem with insurance in the future. So these are just factors that have to be taken into consideration in different parts of the world. And so, like one of the things that the Mekong Club does with certain hotels is we help them to identify, systems and procedures within their organization to determine, if they feel like sex trafficking or prostitution or something is taking place within the hotel. So there are two extremes. There are some hotels that, allow anyone to come in and do whatever they want in the hotel, and they turn the other way because they don't want to offend any of their clients. And there's others that, for example, in Thailand, if a guy comes in at 2 or 3 in the morning with a young woman and it doesn't look as if they're related because he signed in alone and so forth, they'll be stopped. They'll have to register. Sometimes they have to pay additional money and so forth because they're trying to determine whether there's an issue. But then there are other scenarios where in a hotel, there are patterns that exist related to potential victims, the perpetrators, that could lead to the possibility of something happening within the rooms. And so there are protocols that are developed so that if the cleaning staff or the security staff or the front staff people see this, then there's a process and procedure that takes place that goes through a series of steps, and then a determination as to whether something is going to be done or not happens. Again, it's up to hotels to decide if they want to do that or not. Some do, many don't. But some hotels want to move in that direction. So the training that's offered is training of employees. It helps the security people and the senior management included the departments to know what it is that's happening or not happening. And then they developed this mechanism where if, and I'll show you some indicators in a few minutes, these indicators are seen, they get reported, and then maybe a meeting is convened, and then a determination takes place. So red flags related to this would be numerous men coming in and out of a particular room or congregating outside of a room, room payments made in cash and not in credit cards, refusal of cleaning staff being invited to basically offer that particular type of services, regular requests for towels, because sometimes the clients will use the showers after the sex act has been done. Security measures put in place to keep people inside from entering the room. You can see, for example, and I've seen this in different hotels in different parts of the world, where you actually have the traffickers that are standing outside, or they put a chair outside and they sit there and they monitor what's going in and out. The room contains many used condoms or condom containers and so forth. And so these would be kind of the types of things that would be a red flag. So if a cleaner went in and saw these types of things or wasn't able to get in, or you're seeing the security footage showing these types of things, these are indicators of modern slavery. Red flags related to the victim. And again, this isn't just women and girls. It could be boys and sometimes even men. That's a lot less common. It's about 15% of sex trafficking victims would be men and boys. Most of them would be women, but she's not allowed to go into a public place without somebody following her. Somebody checks into the hotel. She's standing off to the side, looking uncomfortable. She doesn't have many possessions. She's looking down. She looks nervous. She's not making eye contact. She appears to provide a rehearsed response. If she's asked questions, and sometimes hotels will approach people like this, she turns to the person who brought her in and doesn't respond. She doesn't want to get into, or the responses seem like she's taking what she's been told to say and responding to it. Sometimes they show signs of injury or abuse. Sometimes they get hit because they don't do what they're supposed to, or they stay too long with a client, or various other things. You can see the treatment of the individual being somewhat aggressive. Let's say that after the person checks in, he goes and he reaches her and he grabs her arm really hard or pushes her or something. It's just not appropriate type of behavior. And sometimes sexually explicit clothing could be an indicator. So any of these by themselves could be just, a coincidence, but if you have multiple versions of these indicators, then, and you suspect that there may be something going on in your hotel. As I say, some hotels develop a protocol. And so if you look at kind of trafficked victims within the hotel, there's different times when there are entry points of your hotel having interaction with the clientele, setting up the booking, when they arrive and checking in and so forth, when they're actually in the room and when they're departing and so forth. At different points, you have different people who are looking at what's happening in those particular spaces. And so as a result of that, again, there are these protocols that can be put in place. Recently in Macau, I worked with a particular hotel that was really concerned because there was some arrests associated with prostitution, and they didn't want that to happen anymore. And they wanted to have more of a family feel within their organization. And so we sat down and with their people, and we negotiated and facilitated them developing some type of a policy, which prepares a plan and then reports if they see something, makes a decision, and then based on that cycle, they go back again to see whether or not they got it right. And then they use that as a basis of making certain determinations. The last sector that I wanted to talk about is construction. And I mentioned this in part one. I'll mention it again. The big scam usually related to construction is, and I've seen a lot of this in like places like Cambodia and Thailand, where you have a legitimate construction company that subcontracts, and at the lowest level of the subcontracting, migrants are often given jobs. And sometimes they're told, well, you can work, but we can't pay you for 3 months. But after 3 months, we'll pay you. So the person takes the job, works for 3 months, borrows money to survive and everything, expecting to be paid. And then the construction company, a foreman or the subcontractor says, well, we need more time and more time and more time. So that's spread out. The person can't leave because they would lose everything, but the person is beginning to wonder whether they'll ever be paid. They start putting a lot of pressure on the people who hired them, and then eventually a call is made to the immigration police. The person is picked up and then deported. And so the person was never going to be paid. It's a particular type of scam, but we see this a lot in the construction industry. One way of determining if there's any vulnerability is to just go to the construction sites with one of your risk officers or compliance officers and just walk around. And if you see somebody who looks like they're a migrant, you can ask some simple questions and then determine if there's any vulnerability. But just about all the construction sites that I visited across Asia often had some type of labor exploitation, not always to the extent of it being modern slavery, but enough for it to be concerning. And so, if you wanted to do due diligence, it's pretty easy to be able to do that type of thing. Oh, actually, there is one more. And that is another thing that the Mekong Club does is we bring our hotel community together to basically meet with other hotels to talk about the issue of modern slavery, to debate and discuss and identify things that they feel are necessary in order for the hotel industry to figure out what they need. For example, when we did this over the last 10 years, they wanted e-learning. They wanted special types of training. They wanted a guideline that would identify what the minimum amount that hotels should do. And so we developed all of these things and gave it back to the community. So sometimes being together with other individuals who are trying to do the same thing related to modern slavery allows a company to compare themselves to other companies to get a general sense of how are we doing relative to how other companies are doing. Sometimes within these meetings, organizations will mentor other organizations. So maybe these hotels are competing in the real world, but not on this particular topic. Hotels are sharing information and because they want the entire sector to be perceived as positive and supportive and so forth. So the Mekong Club is an organization that works with the private sector, as I mentioned. We work with the hotels, the banks, the manufacturers, the retail industry, and we basically help them to understand what they need to do related to this particular topic. You know why the hotels look at this. Why would the banks be concerned about this? Well, you heard me say that $150 billion was generated from modern slavery. If any of that dirty money gets into a legitimate bank, it gets fined. There was one bank in Australia that was fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars. So banks need to care about this. And obviously, the retailers and the manufacturers that make things have to care about this because if they don't, and somebody finds out there's something in their supply chain, sweatshops, people being exploited, it can have a devastating impact on them. We do a baseline survey to determine, what a company has in place and doesn't have in place. And then after that, we provide the training and the consultation, everything else that's needed related to that. I mentioned that we do a fair amount of work with suppliers and SMEs. We recently developed a tool. It's online. You can give it to your suppliers that helps them to understand how they can address their specific requirements related to modern slavery. So it talks about if you don't have a policy, this is where you get a policy. If you're not raising awareness, it gives you information on how that supplier can raise awareness. If for example, you have a need for a grievance mechanism, it explains how that's done. So this is just a simple toolkit that allows for suppliers and SMEs that you work with to understand various things. I mentioned the guidelines. The way the guideline works is it's a series of drop-down menus, and so you can look at what the table of contents is, and then you keep hitting subsets and subsets, and it explains what you need to do as a hotel and so forth. And lastly, e-learning. We have e-learning videos and so forth that we offer related to this particular topic. I often say that the organizations that take modern slavery, human trafficking, child labor seriously, and they put systems and procedures in place are heroic because by you protecting your business, by providing the training, providing the awareness raising, by putting systems and procedures in place, you're protecting your business, but at the same time, it protects people as well. And I say this because it's important that people understand that the private sector does care about these topics. The private sector does put systems and procedures in place. And a lot of people don't know that. They don't know that hotels try to protect the environment, try to ensure that there isn't waste, that they treat their own people and their clientele in a particular way. And when I present to the general public, I often talk about the great things that the hospitality sector is doing, because it's important for people to know that organizations like yours care enough to even attend something like this particular talk.